Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Arianna. Hi, Arianna. Thank you for being on this episode of the podcast.
Hello, Jon. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Arianna is also a shareholder and one of our consultants, and really focuses in kind of what I would say 3 key areas, even though you do a lot with firms. That's process, how it integrates with technology, but as well as talent. And so we have an interesting conversation here around signs your remote team members need more training. So of course, as firms start to be more distributed, not just for the short term, but also for the long term, this topic is really relevant. So, Arianna, what are some signs that your remote staff, speaking to firm leaders, might need more training?
And it's funny because many of these different signs can be misinterpreted as having other root causes besides training. So for instance, miscommunication. So if you're seeing a lot of miscommunication happening between your staff, whether you're in a fully remote environment still or a hybrid environment, the signs of miscommunication could lead to a need for training. Reduced collaboration, where people really aren't collaborating well together, or you're seeing more work in silos. A lack of connection or engagement. I know we're seeing a lot of concerns with talent and retention, but some of the roots of that could actually be in training, as opposed to some of those other things that we think about causing that lack of connection and lack of engagement. Some of the other things that are maybe harder at first glance to connect are too much working on evenings and weekends. And the reason that we would connect that to training is because maybe people haven't figured out their system of actually turning off from work and really being able to, disengage from their work and take that personal time when they're working from home. So we want to make sure that we're, really focusing on training our people well in that. And then unnecessary meetings, which goes back to that whole point of not communicating well. If we're meeting just for the sake of having meetings and you're seeing an increase in your remote or hybrid staff with more unnecessary meetings, that could also tie back to a need for training.
That's great. So you mentioned communication, collaboration, engagement, working nights and weekends, unnecessary meetings. Sometimes we see those things and maybe we don't necessarily view them as signs that training is needed, or maybe we don't even view them as signs or, as kind of topics that training could even help address largely. But you're highlighting that there is a ton of opportunity there with those. And maybe it's training people in new areas that we haven't historically trained them now that they're distributed and remote. So what are some strategies you see firms, or maybe strategies you use when helping firms, train their talent to be more productive, communicate better, collaborate more, be more engaged?
Yeah, there are a lot of different strategies to consider. I think one of the first ones is really just taking a look at those symptoms happening within your teams and really evaluating how that root cause can go back to training. Because in order to put together the best really strategies, you have to make sure that you understand the root cause and how it's occurring within your team. Because it could be, very well that the, miscommunication is due to some other initiatives or things like that. But the first thing is to take that step back and make sure that you're connecting to the correct root cause. Then once you have confirmed that there is an opportunity for training, and there often is, because we all know that training is just an area of opportunity in general, things to consider are more training on things like effective communication techniques, really targeting training on how to use those internal communication tools. So maybe how can we leverage Teams? Are we overusing email? When should we just pick up the phone? And with that includes those boundaries on how to use those tools. So think about, some of the hours with which we're communicating, or maybe we're just missing each other in our methods of communication. So one thing that we are really noticing is that there is more of a need around communication standards and communication guidelines now that we are remote. But we want to make sure that it's also purposeful and that people are really grasping and understanding the benefits of looking at communication differently. So that would be one example around the communication side of things.
No, I think all that's great, Ariana. Very spot on. I think one thing we've seen as, even though we've been working remotely for, over 10 years as a company, but even through the pandemic and how this topic is somewhat related to that. But as firms have went through this, we've seen that when firms move to a more distributed kind of workforce, there's introductions of communication around things that are implied communication. So as leaders in our organization, we have to be careful about sending emails at 9 p.m. because is the implication that everyone should be working at 9 p.m. And what are tips and tricks to kind of get around that by using, scheduling tools or that are integrated with Gmail to send, messages at a certain time, or just kind of all those things that maybe didn't necessarily exist prior to the last couple of years, but now they are. And so I guess I say all that to really emphasize that the intentionality of the training that you're recommending here has a lot of positive ripple effects as well on organizations.
And I think some other things to be thinking about when it comes to training that maybe aren't immediately top of mind are setting expectations. So first, we want to really establish some framework and boundaries around communications in our remote, hybrid, or distributed, world, but also having clear expectations on who should be communicating what. So we want to make sure that everybody understands their authority and their responsibility. Because sometimes that can be unclear, especially among remote team members, understanding where they fit in, especially if you have some people who are in the office and some people who are working remotely. So really being clear on where the authority and the responsibility is for communication, both internally and externally. And then also finding a way to keep the conversations and communications visible. So if you are using an internal workflow software, making sure that you're using that to capture notes, to capture communications, so that those things that are pertinent for that visibility aren't just stuck in two email inboxes, from the person who sent the email to the person who received it, but everyone has access to that information. So there's even more clarity. So you start with setting those expectations around the authority and the responsibility, and then leveraging those workflow tools to help capture that information to increase that visibility is really helpful. But all that takes training. We need to train people on how to have those conversations in some cases, in supervisor roles, how to really have those conversations effectively. But then we might also need some workflow training. So we need to make sure that we're doing that as well, and not assuming, that's another area where we can assume that people just know how to use that software. We need to make sure that we're training them well on that.
That's great. So if firms really start to get their arms around this training, be intentional about the types of training that they're providing their team, again, around communication, collaboration, engagement, managing workload, running, well-constructed meetings, high quality meetings. Speak to us about some of the positive results you've seen firms have from this.
So I think one of the most impactful results is in the collaboration. When we're really collaborating well, we can see an increase in the idea sharing. We can see an increase in the connection, also in the engagement, and really people have more clarity around what it is that they're doing and what their role is. And that leads to increased productivity. We've seen, feedback from firms as they started focusing on training, because at first it was this light bulb that, oh, I didn't really think of now that all of this has changed, right? We're not working the way that we used to. I didn't think about the fact that we were going to need to reevaluate how we were training. Now that we've done that, things that we thought were maybe due to other causes, we're now back to seeing those increases in productivity, those increases in collaboration, those increases in morale. So there's really a lot of opportunity in going back and saying, with the new way that we're working, how can we have training that's going to support that and make our people more successful?
Yeah, that's great. And we all know collaboration can really help increase engagement, and which is related to retention. And I don't think many firms today feel overstaffed. They, definitely understaffed. So your points are certainly relevant. We always take a look at outside the profession. Any topic we're talking about, it's important to at least glance outside the profession and say, how, if anything, is this related to our profession, or what's going on outside the profession that we should be aware of inside the profession? So as you think about this topic, Arianna, I mean, some of it's self-explanatory of how it pertains outside the profession, but anything you would add there?
I just think that this challenge is one that's being seen across the board, and being able to learn from other industries and professions and how they're tackling the same issues, because everybody now is trying to figure out how they navigate the new way of work, especially when it comes to remote teams. And so, this isn't just specific to the profession, but I think this is really an opportunity. While there are some things that are really unique to accounting firms, this is one where there is really an advantage that can be used by saying what's working for other organizations, and looking at different articles and different resources to say, how can we apply that to our firm? What pieces of that can we take to make that work? Not always expecting to do a cut and paste, right? You want to evaluate and take the pieces that you feel could work well and learn from others, both within and outside of the profession.
That's great. So as we kind of round out our conversation here, Arianna, for our listeners, I would say most people listening probably are relating to this, saying, hey, there's opportunity within our organization in these areas as it pertains, to training. What are, maybe the next one or two steps you would recommend someone take after listening to this episode?
First, identifying where are your opportunities for improvement, and seeing if you have some of those things that we mentioned during the beginning of our time together, around the miscommunication and lack of engagement, unnecessary meetings, really looking at the hours that people are working, and start to again get to that kind of root cause evaluation of, has our training, we're seeing these things happen. And then the next question that you need to ask yourself is, have we re-engineered or recreated or addressed training in a way that will allow us to really support the new way of work? So I think it starts with looking at what are the opportunities, or you could look at them as issues. We like to look at them as opportunities that you're seeing. And then, have we had training to help address those specific areas? And then from there, you need to put together a training plan to start to really help to see improvements in those areas.
Excellent advice on next steps. So if our listeners had any questions for you or wanted to reach out, what's the best way in which they can contact you?
You can reach out to me via email, arianna.campbell@boomer.com. Also on social media, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's one of the best ways on social media to reach out. You can find me at Arianna Campbell. I'm also on Twitter. Would love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Awesome. Well, Arianna, as always, thank you for making yourself available to be on this podcast. And these topics are extremely relevant to our listeners today. So thank you. For our listeners, if you like these types of topics, know that we release new episodes every Tuesday morning, and we always switch up the topics. This week it might be on talent. Next week it might be on technology or process or growth or leadership. But the common theme among all of those topics is that they are critical to your business success. So thanks for listening, and please subscribe. Thanks, Arianna.
Thanks, John.